This is Art364 Part 15, continuing with the 20th century. In the 20th century, in the prior uh, movements that we've seen up until now, uh, the the thing that they have in common is that they all are reactions against the academy and uh, the traditions of art in general. And with each one, you see some aspect of tradition, or specifically the academy, that is sort of being peeled away uh, to move in a different direction, to move away from tradition in some way or another. With the realist, it was to take away uh, the imaginary subject matter, or certain kinds of finish to the picture. With each one, the Impressionists had their own movement manifesto of doing something different from the academy. And as that moved forward, we get to the 20th century and deliberately uh, not using local color, or deliberately making something not beautiful, uh, deliberately breaking up the figure in the ground in some way that it is consciously about solving visual problems, not about representing things. This painting is by Vasily Kandinsky in the early part of the 20th century. And as many of these artists that we're going to see of the early 20th century, they went through phases. That is, as in their learning how to be artists, they would go through a impressionist phase, say, or a post-impressionist. Maybe they'll follow a Cezanne or Gauguin, or Matisse or Picasso, or they will they will learn their trade starting in one of these reactionary groups, and then move forward until they get to uh, the thing that is their signature thing. In this case, Kandinsky, in his early work, this is a what we call a representational picture. It's you can see it has buildings. It's a landscape. There's some people in it down here, but the color is kind of wild. You can say this looks like it's influenced by the fauves, like Matisse and that we saw before, non-local color, and this sort of having a sort of a dark line around things called a cloisonné technique. Um, Gauguin did that, and Van Gogh did that. I mean, so you can see it has influenced by some of the previous artists, but Kandinsky's moved in a different direction. When you similar to Picasso, moving away from representation a little bit. This is a very abstract version of a picture where you can recognize that it has a kind of a horse's head here, and there's maybe a jockey, and there's some lines to indicate motion, like it's moving really fast. But you can it's still representational in that you can recognize things from the real world that are being represented in some way. Um, Picasso did this. Where the Cubist picture that we saw, the Majoli, was so far removed from representation, but you could still a little bit see what was going on. And for many artists, there was a kind of a kind of a wall you come to. You get abstraction. Um, Things become more and more abstract until uh, you'd have to decide, well, am I going to paint something that is completely abstract, that is where there's no representation at all? And it was a difficult hurdle to go over. I mean, many artists approached it but didn't get there. But Kandinsky would be the first to do something that was entirely non-representational, that is consciously making a picture that is completely devoid of representation. When we think back to um, Whistler and his Falling Rockets, for example, that one, you could see it as a non-representational picture, but once you read the title and you say, oh, it's Falling Rockets, okay, there's fireworks, and it looks like um, what we thought was non-representational. It actually does represent something. But many artists uh, resisted that. Picasso, for example, always painted representational things, no matter how abstract it got. You could always recognize something from the real world in it, usually figurative. But Kandinsky was an art theorist, and he wrote a lot about art. He was a Russian, and he came up having learned all of these techniques, all these styles that had preceded him in the early part of the 20th century. And he also had another feature that was kind of odd. He was called a synesthete. That is, a person who could. It's when you take one sense and is confused with another in a way that, like, say, in his case, he could hear colors. That is, the sensation of looking at a color would come to him, and instead of, or in addition to seeing it, he could also hear it. So, and he was also very interested in music. And music, one of its main features, especially classical music, is that it's non-representational. It just is what it is. Notes of different kinds, melodies, harmonies, all of these things are things that metaphorical have a relationship to works of art, but in the musical world, it's entirely abstract. And he sort of theorized, making pictures that were abstract in the same sense that music is abstract. And since he was a person who kind of had this sort of dual sensation of color and sound, he was the first to do this. So this is a painting called Black Lines, but it's he named his pictures, in addition to black, it's also called improv. The words that refer to musical things, like the word using composition for musical composition, and using the name composition for a painting composition. They work in parallel. Similar to what Whistler did. He also named, like, Nocturne is a kind of a musical piece, using names that use for musical things in painting, so as to make a relationship between those two things. What you have here are just a bunch of marks on the surface, black lines, and they're kind of wild. They don't seem to relate to anything. There are lines that go one way and another, and they're organic, and the colors change from one thing to another. Patches of blues and yellows, and just things that don't relate to anything. If you wanted to, I suppose you could say, okay, this may be a landscape, and this is the edge between the hill and the sky. This kind of is a little like a mountain. And you could also see these things as moving things, like, the line is expressed when something moves. Or they could be the strings of musical instruments, but there really isn't anything that you have to interpret it as. The intention is to look at it as color and form and movement and all those other things. It doesn't seem as big a deal now, because we're all used to abstract art, and that it's a norm. And in fact, art students in school learn it as just one of the other things, one of the other options you have when you make a work. It can be representation or non-representational. But in 1911, 12, in this period, there was lots of upheaval and lots of change going on in the world, and the idea of making a picture that is entirely non-representational was a big deal. It was a very big change. It was, one of the biggest aspects of the traditional art is that it meant that it was a picture of something. And if you take that away, for most people, what do you have? I mean, it's not. Most people look at art. Big non-trained people, the general public, would expect that if it's a work of art, it should be a picture of something. You should read it as a picture of something, and that has been the norm from the beginning. But so this was a very revolutionary act to make such a thing. He also See, he went on. Uh, these are other examples of his works, in the following decades. They're not organic. This one is, geometric shapes and angular things, hard edge things, instead of, blendy things, that are painterly. Here's one with circles. Here's one that um, has hard edge things, and you could see that it's more about movement, and this actually has a jazz look. I look at this as jazz, which was also being invented at the time. The idea of being able to just make something uh, straight out of your mind without any without without being drawn from something from the real world. That is, you don't you're in your studio, you have an easel, but you're not looking at something. It's all coming out of your own head, rather than your response to something that you're seeing. This would be perhaps a response to something that you're hearing, and that it's about the improvisation of music. That it just things just happen, and here's a shape, here's a color, and here they are in this new world, and they're relating to one another according to the rules of form. There's another Russian artist named Malevich, who was working within a couple of years of Kandinsky, who also went in the same route. He was also an art theorist and wrote extensively about art theory, and taught art. And uh, uh, his take on the same thing that Kandinsky was doing was called the idea of suprematist compositions, which has to do with supreme feelings, like uh, putting feelings entirely into a picture without reference to anything intellectual. Uh, and it's hard to square. Just if you start reading what he says about art and you actually look at his work, it's kind of hard to see how it relates. But uh, uh, this is one of his earlier compositions called "White on White," where it's just a white square on a white background. There's a tiny bit of temperature difference between one and the other. There's a tiny bit of line around the square, and the square is not um, parallel. It's a little bit tilted. Apart from that, there is no other content. There is no. It's not a representation of a square. It is a square. So that's a profound difference from representational art. Because when you think of compositions that might have something that's square in it, it is a square that's representing something out in the real world that may be square. In this case, it's not representing something that is a square. It just is what it is. It's a square. It has a color. It has temperature. It has a value, and it has in this case, an orientation. That is, its relationship to the format is at an angle. It's skewed, and it's not in the center. So the artist is attempting to create some sort of unified picture where you have two different elements, and that's all. Two elements, and one it relates to the other in some way. In this case, there's a kind of a tension that occurs by having these corners kind of closer up here. You feel a tension that has to do with the way you perceive objects, and the psychology of perception is a very complex thing, and it's kind of hard to even understand what's going on when you see things. Why it is that this feels like there's a kind of an energy going on with something is so simple as this, but he's able to put these things together. Like let me go to the this is the one that's on your list. It's called Suprematist Composition with 8 red rectangles. Um, it looks. I mean, I look at this and I imagine that he took a piece of red construction paper, say, and cut out some rectangles just by eye, not even using a ruler or anything, to just made it and just stuck them on the rectangular canvas and just moved them around until he got them into a pleasing composition, something that that's not done by a ruler. It looks like he's put things generally in a diagonal position, but not with any kind of rigidness. Like you can see that these are, it's a little closer here than over here, and that this, is not quite square corners, not even quite straight lines. But he puts them in such a way so similar to the previous one, and there's a kind of a tension that occurs. This one is touching the edge, and this little closeness here. It just feels like there's a kind of an energy between all of these things, and it's just boiling down composition into just uh, the minimal things that you need to make something happen, so that you look at it and you feel something about it. That is, you get a reading, you get an experience of looking at these things. Another artist is next one is Spanish. His name is Juan Miro, and he's from Barcelona, like Picasso, and he did work similar to Picasso. He just as Malevich, just as Kandinski, went through phases of all the previous artists that we've been looking at as reacting in some way to tradition. His take was not necessarily go entirely to abstraction or like non-representational things, because you can see things that are represented. There's a figure down here, it has a face, and there's a figure here. There's a face here in the negative shape. This kind of looks like if this is a body, these are legs, and it may be someone kind of dancing. There are other faces in it. So you could recognize things, but they're so far removed. These shapes are called biomorphs. Bio means life, and morph is form, a form of life. That is the kind of forms that you get in living things, that they're round or have roundishness to them. And so he uses this as his formal elements. He has line, he has solid shapes with kind of hard edges, and he's dealing with positives and negatives. He has a very simple background of a tone up here and another tone down here, so there's a relationship of color. Then he has black and white. But what he's dealing with, unlike the intellectual aspect of the suprematist, the Malevich, or the sort of spiritual aspect of Kandinsky, this is more of a psychological thing. This is related to a movement called Surrealism, which had to do with trying to take imagery and forms from one's subconscious, especially dreams, and using those. And like imagine trying to draw or create something where you're not really thinking about it, where you just draw on whatever comes out of your subconscious without passing through the intellect and all. So that's what's going on with this kind of picture. The work that's on your list is called uh, the Harlequin, Harlequin Carnival, and this is similar to the previous one, but it has just more stuff. I mean, it's just almost like a celebration. It looks like a festive thing going on with lots and lots of shapes, and there seems to be a kind of a space, like this little shape right here makes this look like a corner of a room, like that's a wall, and this is a wall, and there are things in the room, little objects, and they're kind of like the objects that come in from dreams. That is, they don't have a real clear interpretation. Some musical stuff. There's something that looks like a guitar. There's something that looks like the musical staff. There's a treble clef, just like Picasso did. All these are relatively hard-edged things. It's not especially painterly, but they're just little objects, little biomorphs, and they seem to be just randomly around. This is just a picture out of his subconscious of stuff, of little objects, and all relating using formal elements of color and design and movement and positive and negative shapes. But there's something else going on here you would probably never recognize if it weren't pointed out. But if you remember Velázquez's painting of the Las Meninas with Velázquez here with his big mustache, and he's standing there with his palette, and he has a paintbrush in his hand, and he's standing in front of this, where this looks like a ladder, but this is kind of like the easel of the painting that he was painting in that painting in the Las Meninas. With the princess was here, and there was a window up here, or at least a doorway back there, or stairs going back. Uh, there's several things that correspond to that painting. Uh, Velasquez was Spanish, just as Miro was Spanish. So this would be something from his world that he would see. And if you imagine looking at that painting and then having a dream where other things from your subconscious are pouring in and distorting the things from the dream, you get something like this, filtered through the mind of Juan Guerrero. So far, we've seen different ways of abstraction, sort of an intellectual, spiritual way, or a subconscious way. And they all are came from the different journeys of these people as they went through their studies, getting to this point. That is, they didn't go to school and learn to do abstract stuff. They went to school and they learned, or at least they began painting by studying the works of the previous artists, the Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, the earliest 20th century artists, and then moved in the direction of abstraction, or into this direction, and created these things. It isn't so much later to have people who just start out as abstract artists. These people who move in the direction of abstraction. If you look at their earlier works, you see it's much different. All right, the next artist is also an abstract artist, but he's Dutch. This is part of this is Piet Mondrian. He's part of a movement called the style. In Dutch is de stijl, and it was a kind of a utopian fantasy kind of movement where all of the horrors of the world going on, and some people react to it one way and some another way, and their reaction was to try to imagine a world that was perfect, imagine a world that didn't have war and horrors and death and grief, but one where everything was arranged perfectly, just like you want it, without all the extra baggage. Mondrian began as a representational painter. He went through several phases, most notably a Cubist phase, where he went through, looked at Picasso's and he made his own Cubist versions of things. But as he got further and further away from representation and more into turning things into facets, he got rid of all the extraneous stuff and started making pictures that had a very simple set of rules. And that simple set of rules was that the only colors he would have would be the three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and three primary values, that is black, white, and gray. And he would also have the two primary directions, horizontal and vertical. So using that set of limitations, he could find still an infinite variety of opportunities to make compositions. His compositions are all asymmetrical, what we call asymmetrical balance. That is, trying to using these vertical lines with white rectangles and some colored rectangles, arranging them in all different various ways so as to create a balance, a harmony, where everything is exactly where it needs to be. The red square is just as big as it needs to be, and that particular shade of red, particular shade of blue and yellow work ideally with each other. If it wouldn't work if the red were a little bit bigger or a little smaller, or his position were a little off. He would make these paintings and adjust them. If you look at one of them up close, You can see where he's moved the lines over, just adjusting, almost calibrating them, just by taking in all of the different forces, I guess you could call, of the visual elements, like um, the effect that this white square has in relationship to the red square, the effect of it being up here as opposed to being down here. Maybe at one time he had this is the red and this is the yellow. Oh, that would be a completely different thing. If the yellow were up here and the red were down here, oh, the yellow would overwhelm it. He has to have a smaller amount of yellow. Maybe he's moved this black line over from over here where, just to get the right amount of yellow, the right amount of blue, so that it's all in a kind of a balance. Um, here's the one you have on your list. And you can see how he's, it has exactly the same elements. But here he's got this great big white rectangle or white square in the middle, and everything revolves around it. And you can see how he's uh, made even more minimal the amount of red, the amount of yellow, and the amount of blue, so as to have, this, in his eye, the right balance in terms of vertical, horizontal movements, and the sizes, the amount of area for each of the different elements. And he made, I think hundreds of these things, all variations on one. Some of them have grays in them. Some of them where they're square, but he takes it and turns it at 45 degrees so that it's, you're seeing a diamond shape. Yet the black lines and everything are still vertical and horizontal. The movement, the style movement. There was a magazine, there was a manifesto, there was a scholarly journal, I guess you could call it, and it was craftspeople and painters and even architects. We'll see example of that shortly. All were part of this movement of wanting to fill the whole world, not just paintings in a museum, but the museum itself and your houses and your cutlery on your table. Everything would be using these same elements. You recognize this from that same world. The Monopoly board was designed with Mondrian paintings in mind. Later in life, in the 40s, he painted this, where the lines become. He no longer has the black lines. He has yellow lines that are chopped up into other shapes. This is, during the war, he moved from Holland because of the war. He moved to Manhattan, and so this one's called Broadway Boogie Woogie, and it's kind of his reaction to New York and the streets of New York. It's like you can see these as streets, and you see the yellow dots as taxis, and these are buildings. So it's kind of representational, but it's still the world that he created with the same limitations. It's just, when you look at those limitations, you may imagine, well, you could only make so many pictures with those, but no, you can make an infinite number. In architecture, Rietveld is the architect, and taking the same idea as Mondrian's paintings have, the same few minimalist elements, and creating a world where everything is geometric and balanced in this asymmetry fashion. He created what's called the Schroeder House as a showpiece, as an example of this look. You can see it has white and gray with a few elements like there's black lines, and there's some yellow bits here and there, and there's other colors. I think here's a model of it. You can see it's as if you took a Mondrian painting and made a building out of it. These were this movement, wanted to create this utopia where everything was like this. So you imagine living in a world where your cabinets were all a solid yellow, and the walls were black, and there's a red square on the floor. Even the furniture is kind of like a Mondrian painting as well. Horizontal, vertical, red, yellow, and blue, and black and white. I guess they couldn't make a radiator with sharp corners. That's what this is, a heating device, a radiator. But I suppose if they worked on it, they could make everything in the same world. It wasn't successful. That is, within a very limited area, limited audience, there were people who loved this world and they created some buildings. There was lots of graphic styles came out of it, but they weren't able to create an entire utopian world with it. Next, we have Frank Lloyd Wright, American architect. He apprenticed with Louis Sullivan, who he did the Wainwright building in the previous video, that first skyscraper that we looked at. His job was to draw the plans for those kinds of buildings, and he learned architecture in the traditional fashion, but Wright's Wright's work differed from tradition. It wasn't that he wanted to, dispense with tradition at all. He wasn't especially interested in ornament, like what we saw with the Wainwright building was like a throwback to something to an earlier era, to the Italian palazzos, or having a skyscraper with a surface detail that's different from what's on the inside. His was more of what we call an honest architecture, where you saw exactly what it was, and that he called it organic architecture, where the building was in harmony with humanity, with the people in it, and with the environment of the building, so that the building fit within its environment. Fitting with his environment, you can see this. This is his most famous work is called Falling Water, which is a house, a residence. It's I think it's in Pennsylvania. It's on a creek in the mountains, and you can see that the house is built right on the creek. In fact, it goes under the house, and from the inside of the house, you can look down into the water, so that the building fits into the landscape, and the landscape is sort of going in and out of the building. So indoors and outdoors are sort of mixed together. So when you experience the building as though you're still in the outside, or there's not a strict line between the inside and the outside. He also has this. This is a picture of the model of it. His buildings often have a kind of a core based on the hearth. The hearth is the fireplace. So a big slab of heavy hearth right in the middle of the building, and everything radiating out of it. You can see that the shapes radiating out of it are sort of like Mondrian shapes. That is, they're rectangles. They're all horizontal and vertical and parallel to one another. Having that as the heart as being the middle of the home, that it has to do with that the organic architecture and relating the building to the people. It's about relating to humanity. That is, you think of the heart, the building as the spaces that you're in, and the feeling that you have when you're in it, and that it's all related to making the ideal experience of being in it and moving around inside this building. I can show you some interior pictures. He was in addition to making the shell of the house, he also made all of the interior stuff, like all of the cabinetry and furniture inside the house. So if you were a person who wanted to have a house built by Wright, he would do everything. In fact, he would make rules so that you couldn't do anything other to change the house. That you couldn't bring anything from the outside that was incompatible with the architecture. He wanted to design the whole world, similar to what the Mondrian and the Schroeder house, that sort of thing, where you're designing the entire experience. But when I think of the to steel, and that the environment that you would be in the Schroeder house. Let's look back at that. It's not really based on the feeling of the person in the room. It's based on an intellectual idea of perfection, of a kind of a perfection that is based on abstract notions of geometry and shapes and colors, without regard to actual experience of being in it. When I look at being in this space and imagining how it would be feel in this space, I would feel as though I were, as a human being in the space, I would be incompatible with it. That is, I would be the thing that is the odd man out if I were in this space, because everything else, because I'm not geometric and I'm not a primary color, and I wouldn't fit as a formal element within it. So it's not really, it's almost as if it's not really designed for people. Whereas Frank Lloyd Wright's worlds, the insides of his buildings, are built for the person. It's built for the view of looking from one room to another. He was the one who invented the idea of open plan, where the kitchen and the living room and all were all in one open space, so that you could experience more of the building, and you have contrast of materials and craftsmanship and all these other things that go in with it. It's more about the humanity of yourself in the relationship of you to the building than it was in the previous example. Okay, but in the 20th century, we also have skyscrapers. The first one we saw was like a 10-story skyscraper, and this is one from later, from the 1913, I believe. It's the Woolworth building, designed by Gilbert. This is a building that is, when it was made, it was the tallest building in the world. It's like 60 stories tall, and it's held that title until 1930, I think, when the Chrysler building was made. So it was the tallest building in the world for a long time. And the technology of making those was an example of what it looked like with the clouds. It's just like the Wainwright building, in that it is a grid of I-beams put together, creating the structure of the building. This looks just like the building of the Wainwright building, and you can just put as many of these as you want, going up as high as you want, until you reach the limits of what the strength is of steel. And as with the Wainwright building, the internal part is the structure, and the external part is just a surface decoration. And in this case, the surface decoration is Gothic. We saw that before with the House of Parliament. The House of Parliament was the bones of the building was a neoclassical traditional building based on masonry, stone masonry, and presumably it has wood beams and things for its roof and things. But this is a building that has its bones are the modern steel structure of steel gridded structure, and the external skeleton, or the exterior look, is that of a Gothic building. Here's the top of it, and if you look at this looks very much indistinguishable from what you would see from the top of a late medieval cathedral tower. It's I guess it's flamboyant or Raynaud Gothic, with the crockets everywhere and all the ornamental stuff. They put lots and lots of ornament right here at the tippy top. But the most of the building, the vertical parts, they're just this attenuated version, that is stretched out version of Gothic, just like the House of Parliament, except it's being a skyscraper. They got 60 stories to fill with this curtain of decoration. So that's those are two examples. Both of them are American. This is the skyscraper and the work of Frank Lloyd Wright.